Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In the very beginning of his work, The Categories, which is often assigned to students as the first work that they encounter of Aristotle's, there is a very important distinction that gets made as the first topic of discussion. And Aristotle goes through it fairly quickly, but we want to dwell on it a bit and use some additional examples to try to drive home what's actually under discussion here. Now, this is a distinction between three different ways in which terms can be used, or the way that he talks about it as being named. So what we're talking about here are not a term just on its own, although we'll come back to that in a moment, because that does enter into our actual use of these sorts of things when we say something is an equivocal term, or there's an equivocation on that term, or that it's ambiguous, and we mean by that it's equivocal in that sense. The distinction itself is going to be between what we call univocal terms, equivocal terms, and what here in the categories Aristotle is calling derivative terms, terms that are derived one from the other. And I do want to point out that because this is such a very important distinction running throughout Aristotle's works, you're also going to see this third category described and to some degree developed in different ways in other works. So sometimes he'll talk about it as analogous, kat analogian, instead of being paronuma. Sometimes he will talk about it in terms of a special kind of equivocity. We're putting aside any concerns or preoccupations with that here so that we can concentrate just on what's actually being said in the categories, because I think that's probably enough to take in at one sitting. So you notice that we've got the Greek terms. I Latinized the letters, but this is the Greek vocabulary for it. Sunonuma, we get the word synonymous from that, right? And that is what we translate as univocal, meaning that it has one way of talking about things, right? The univocal, by the way, is coming from the Latin, unum and voce. Now, equivocal, homonuma, right? Equivocity, right, from the Latin. And this is the word that we get homonym from. And we'll come back to that notion in a moment. And then we have paronuma. Para is a Greek term which means sort of like beside or next to, or it means a number of other things as well, the way that many prepositions do. And we translate this as derivative because it shows a relation of one thing stemming from or deriving from another. Now you notice that all these have this onuma in there. Well, that's the Greek term that is used for name, and it's also the term that in Greek grammar, at least classical Greek grammar, is used for noun. And so what we're talking about here are the names of things that we could, in some cases, point to. It's not as if you can point to knowledge inside somebody's head, although we use the word knowledge. Now, why is this distinction so important? Well, there are many cases where we're using language in ways that we don't realize we're not actually referring to the same thing, and we get into arguments with each other. So, for example, terms like freedom may have a core meaning, but oftentimes they are equivocal terms. And if we don't recognize the equivocity, we can go wrong in our reasoning about them, and we can get into arguments where we're in effect talking past each other because we're not actually talking about the same thing. Let's start with what really is, in many respects, the simplest concept, the univocal thing. So what we have here is a name in common. And then Aristotle will go on to say they also have the same, and what we translate here as statement of essence. The Greek is, referring to a logos. Logos, we're translating here as statement, can also mean account, description. It's the word that we get reason from. All those ologies, those are coming from logos. It also means speech. So it's got a wide range. It means argument, too. It's got a wide range of meaning itself. You could say logos itself might be an equivocal term or a derivative term. But let's put that reflection aside for a moment. So it has the same statement of essence, the same logos tes ousias. Ousia is ousias then is being or essence or what it is that makes the thing the thing. So if we think about, for example, these various pieces of chalk in my hand, they all have the same ousia. They all have the same essence or being. That's why I can change them one for the other. It doesn't matter which one I write on the chalkboard with, other than perhaps they're getting a little bit small to work with. Likewise, clothing, tie, shirt, whatever else a person happens to be wearing, those could all be understood as being the same sort of thing insofar as they are clothes. Obviously, a tie is not the same thing as a shirt, so it could be differentiated in another way. We'll come back to the examples that he's talking about in a moment because I want to stress this difference between univocal and equivocal. So with equivocal, notice that there's something that they share. The name is in common here. The name is also in common here. So that's not what's differentiating them. What is differentiating them is that you're using the name to talk about two or more very different things. They don't have the same statement of essence. They don't have the same account. Aristotle will also use the word definition, horos, to talk about this. Not in terms of like a dictionary definition, but a definition that actually states what the thing is, rather than just what people talk about in the thing being. Now, this in cases like this, we are using the same word to denote different things. So we have Aristotle's example, but I think it may be very useful here to use some examples that are a little bit closer to our own time. I mentioned freedom. When people get in arguments, or another great example from our own contemporary culture would be choice, right? In political context, you're pro-choice. That means that you're for abortion. Or wait a second, couldn't it also mean that you're for charter schools? Well, now it depends on the context, doesn't it? And so we get into all these, interesting battles back and forth. Well, you're pro-choice over here, but you're not really pro-choice because you're not for charter schools or other educational alternatives. Or you're pro-school choice, but you're not really pro-choice because you're not for, a woman's right to choose to have an abortion or not, right? These are very different understandings of what it means to be pro-choice. That is, to have that term predicated of somebody's mindset or political commitments or a program that they are advocating. We could go on and on and on with lots of interesting examples like that, but let's use some examples that are a little bit less political and closer to objects themselves, because being pro-choice or talking about freedom, that's a little bit of an abstraction. The word seal. This is one that I use very often in teaching this material. What does seal mean? Well, one thing that it means is like on a bag when you close it off, that's a seal. We have a tight seal, or the seal is letting air in. But it's also an animal. The animal that we see swimming around in the ocean and doing cute things, and maybe, if it's tame, playing the horns or something along those lines. Then again, it can also mean something like a ring or a stamp that you use to seal something. And it can even refer to, when we have a state or a country or an office, the thing, that embossed thing, that's the seal of the President of the United States. Now, those are 4 different terms, and 2 of them seem to be derivative, right? The seal of the President of the United States is connected with that stamping thing. And that stamping thing historically is also connected with like sealing an envelope, so that perhaps is derivative. But do any of them have anything in common whatsoever with the animal? No. They don't have any statement of essence of what it is that they are that is common, that is shared between them. So if you think that you're talking about one, but somebody else is actually talking about the other one, it's very easy to get mixed up. There are many words that are equivocal in that sense. I mentioned that even the term logos in Greek might be an equivocal term because it has so many different meanings. Perhaps they're connected with each other, though. Perhaps they're more derivative. But there are a number of things. Aristotle at other points will point out the bone in our neck. He calls that a key, but there's also the key that we use to open up the door. This would be an example of equivocal terms. We run into things like this when we talk with people who have a different dialect, and we find out that a term that we're used to using in one context means something different in another. For example, the term fanny, right? Here in the United States, that refers to one's rear end. And so we talk about a fanny pack, for example. Now in Britain, that means something quite different. And so you probably don't want to talk about your fanny pack over there unless you want to, have people be quite confused and perhaps irritated with you. So that's a good example of equivocal terms. Now let's talk about derivative terms. So when we have derivative terms, one term has let's call it original meaning, although this might be relative. We could have terms that are derived from a term, and then another term is derived from that term. So perhaps we don't always trace things back to their origin. But these have the name in common, kind of the name in common, but they have a different grammatical form. So this is a little bit easier to do in languages like classical Greek than it is in English. But it's also possible to do in English. So, for example, this is another case that Aristotle will use in other places. If we talk about health, right? Being healthy is a state of the physical body. We can also talk about mental health, too. That would be a derived term as well. But let's talk about physical health. So we say that a person is in a state of health when every organ in their body is functioning the way that it should and they're not interfering with each other and processes are going on as they should. And I'm not saying that is a perfect definition. Let's just work with that for the time being. Now, if we use the term healthy, we've changed the grammatical form from health, which is a noun, to an adjective, healthy, and we might predicate that of, say, food. This is healthy food. What do we mean in that case? We mean something like that this will conduce to the state of health, or it will bring you back to the state of health, or it will prevent you from leaving the state of health. It's not the state of health itself. And if you thought that that's what it means, then you'd get a bit confused and you could go wrong in your reasoning about it. No, this is food that conduces to health, right? Another example that Aristotle uses is he talks about urine because this was a common diagnostic tool for physicians of his day. Remember, Aristotle's dad was actually a physician. And We can talk about somebody's urine, or we take their blood more often. Somebody's blood being healthy. What we mean there is that is indicative of health. It's not producing the health, but it is something that is rather a product of the health that shows us that somebody is indeed healthy. So these are all connected with some common meaning, some common system of meanings, but it's not exactly the same meaning. But it's not equivocity either, where the terms have nothing in common with each other whatsoever. And many of the things that are quite important for us to discuss and to think about fit into this category of derivative terms. Now, let's look at the examples that Aristotle actually uses. I think it's always helpful to look at his own examples as well as bring up our own. Human and ox can both be described by the word animal. That's not to say they're the same kind of animal, right? Humans are one kind of animal. Oxen are another kind of animal. This isn't a metaphorical thing when you call some big burly guy an ox. That would be an example of a derivative or an equivocal term, wouldn't it? But in this case, we're saying that the human being and the ox are both animals. They both fit under that rubric, that term of animal. And we could go on and talk about the statement of essence. So animals, move around, engage in certain processes like, eating, elimination, sexual reproduction, et cetera, right? Insofar as we consider them as animals, animal is a univocal term. It's denoting the same thing. This would work whether we say human and mosquito. This would work whether we say ox and frog. This would work whether we say, snail and porpoise. Pick whatever you like. So long as it actually is an animal, that works. This wouldn't work if we said human being and amoeba. An amoeba is a different kind of life. It has some things in common with animals, it seems like, but I think we classify it still as something different. All right, let's look at equivocal now. Same sort of example. A human being is called an animal, and a portrait of a human being is also called an animal. A portrait is a portrait of a human being, which is an animal, but the portrait itself is not animal, right? Because it doesn't have the same qualities. And so if we're talking about the portrait as animal, we certainly don't mean animal in the same sense that we do when we're talking about an actually existing human being. So this is quite interesting, right? We could come up with all sorts of other examples, contemporary examples. For example, you're watching me on this video right now, if you are indeed watching this, or at least hearing my voice. Could we predicate animal of the image that you are currently seeing? Yes, because presumably there's an actual person here at some point in time, Dr. Sadler. But my avatar or image, or maybe in the future, hologram or anything like that, is not the same thing, not the same kind of thing as me, even though it resembles me in many respects. We cannot use the term animal in the same sense. For derivative terms, Aristotle actually gives us two examples. He talks about grammar and the grammarian, the person who knows grammar. Grammar is a type of knowledge. Grammarian is the person who possesses and uses that type of knowledge. Courage and courageous. Andrea in Greek sometimes gets translated in these books as heroism, although courage is probably closer. Courageous, right? Noun and adjective. We could also say he behaved courageously, right? That would also be a derivative term. Or he conjugated the verbs grammatically, that is according to the canons of grammar, right? That would also be a derivative term. So these examples, I think, are quite useful. Now you notice that with these examples, there are two terms being given. So I mentioned that we would talk about a term itself as being univocal or equivocal. What do we mean in those cases? Because that will show up later on in other thinkers and sometimes even in Aristotle. If we say that a term by itself is univocal, we mean that it really only has one meaning, and that all the things that we would apply to that term, or that term to, have the same meaning, the same essential meaning, right? If we say that a term is equivocal, what we are saying is that there is an ambiguity there, that the term itself, depending on what it is being used of, may mean something very, very different. And in fact, if we look at the whole range of meanings of the term, for example, seal, as we used, then it will indeed have a number of different unrelated, non-derivative meanings. So that is what Aristotle is talking about as the very first thing in his categories.